They thought they were about to teach her a lesson, but they had no idea they were about to expose their own ignorance. The Harrington Conservatory stood like a monument to excellence, its marble floors reflecting decades of discipline, prestige, and quiet arrogance. A place where talent was not just nurtured but judged, measured, and ranked with precision. And within those walls, only the exceptional were meant to be seen, while everyone else faded into the background without question, without resistance. Evelyn Carter had long existed in that background, a 38-year-old woman dressed in a simple beige cardigan and worn flats, moving quietly through the corridors with a stack of sheet music in her hands. Her presence, so subtle it barely registered to those around her. Students passed her without a glance. Faculty members spoke over her, as if she were part of the furniture, and yet she never reacted, never corrected them, never demanded to be noticed, because she did not need to be. Inside the main rehearsal hall, the atmosphere carried its usual tension. Rows of advanced students seated upright, eyes forward, waiting to be evaluated, to be measured against a standard that felt both inspiring and unforgiving. And at the front stood Professor Daniel Langford, a man whose reputation had been built on precision and authority, his tailored suit immaculate, his posture sharp, his voice controlled, every word delivered with the confidence of someone who believed he understood talent better than anyone else in the room. "This piece," he said, tapping the sheet music resting on the grand piano, "is not just difficult, it is revealing. It exposes weakness, hesitation, and lack of discipline." His eyes scanned the room slowly, assessing, deciding, and then, unexpectedly, they stopped somewhere no one else was looking. Near the back, standing quietly with a set of organized scores, was Evelyn, her posture relaxed, her expression calm, her presence almost invisible until that moment, and something about her stillness seemed to catch his attention, not with curiosity, but with opportunity. A faint smile touched the corner of his lips, subtle, calculated, the kind that signaled a decision had already been made. "Miss Carter," he called out, his voice cutting cleanly through the room, drawing every eye toward her at once. The shift immediate, students turning, whispering, some already exchanging knowing looks as if they understood exactly what was about to happen, because in a place like this, moments like these were not uncommon. Someone would be chosen, placed under pressure, used as an example of what not to do, and the lesson would continue as expected. Evelyn paused for a fraction of a second, not startled, not uncertain, just still, as if something deeper had been acknowledged, and then she looked up, meeting his gaze without resistance, her eyes steady, unreadable, and for a brief moment, something unspoken passed between them, something that did not align with the role he had assigned her, but he ignored it, because control, in that room, had always belonged to him. "Why don't you come forward?" he said, gesturing toward the piano with a casual authority that masked the intention behind it. "Since you spend so much time around these instruments, perhaps it is time we hear what you can do." A ripple of quiet laughter spread through the students, not loud enough to be challenged, but clear enough to define the moment, and still Evelyn said nothing. She simply set the papers aside and began to walk forward, her steps unhurried, her posture unchanged, as if she were not walking into a test, not walking into judgment, but into something else entirely, something that did not need their permission to exist. And as she approached the piano, the room leaned in, certain they already knew how this would end, unaware that in just a few moments, everything they believed about talent, about authority, and about who deserved to be seen was about to quietly collapse. The quiet sound of her footsteps seemed louder now as Evelyn reached the piano, not because the room had grown noisier, but because it had grown still, the kind of stillness that carries expectation, not respect, not yet, but something sharper, something closer to anticipation, because everyone in that room believed they were about to witness a mistake unfold in real time. And Professor Langford allowed that belief to settle. His posture relaxed, his expression composed, though his eyes remained fixed on her with a subtle intensity, as if he were waiting not just to observe, but to confirm. "Take your time," he said, his tone smooth, almost polite, but edged with something unmistakable, something that turned the moment into a quiet performance before a single note had been played. A few students shifted in their seats, one leaned slightly toward another, whispering just enough to draw a suppressed laugh, and still no one challenged it. Because the structure of the room remained intact, authority above, expectation below, and Evelyn somewhere outside of both, stepping into a space that had never been meant for her. She stopped beside the piano bench, her hand resting lightly against the polished surface, her reflection faintly visible beneath her fingers, and for a moment she did not move. She did not sit. She simply stood there, as if acknowledging something deeper than the room itself, something that existed long before this moment and would remain long after it. And then she lowered herself onto the bench, her posture straight, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing steady, the kind of calm that does not come from confidence alone, but from familiarity, and yet no one noticed because they were too busy watching for hesitation. The sheet music sat untouched on the stand, a silent expectation placed there for her to follow, and when she did not reach for it, a subtle shift passed through Langford's expression, a tightening at the edges, though he said nothing, because he believed the outcome had already been decided, and control, in his world, was never questioned. "Whenever you are ready," he added, his voice slightly sharper now, as if prompting her toward the inevitable, and that was when Evelyn lifted her gaze, not toward him, not toward the students, but straight ahead, her eyes steady, her expression unchanged, and something in that stillness did not align with the moment they had created for her. Something about it resisted the role they had assigned, but no one could yet explain why. Her hands moved then, slowly, deliberately, rising above the keys, not trembling, not searching, but waiting, as if the instrument beneath her was not unfamiliar, but known, deeply known, and the room leaned in, drawn by something they did not fully understand, because the certainty that had filled it just moments ago had begun to fracture, quietly, almost imperceptibly, replaced by something else, something less comfortable, something that did not fit their expectations, and in that suspended moment, before a single note had been played, the balance of the room had already begun to shift, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be undone, because for the first time, whether they realized it or not, they were no longer entirely in control of what was about to happen. The first note did not arrive with uncertainty. It arrived with quiet precision, clear and controlled, cutting through the silence in a way that immediately disrupted the expectation that had filled the room, and for a fraction of a second, no one reacted, because the sound did not match what they had prepared themselves to hear. It was not hesitant, not misplaced, not fragile. It was exact, and then the second note followed, and the third, and the melody began to unfold, not rushed, not cautious, but deliberate, as if every note had been placed long before this moment had even begun, and that was when the first shift occurred, subtle but undeniable. A student who had been leaning back sat upright without realizing it. Another lowered her pen mid-sentence, and the quiet amusement that had once hovered in the air began to dissolve, replaced by something else, something quieter, something attentive. Evelyn did not look at the sheet music. She did not adjust her posture. She did not search for the next note. Her hands moved across the keys with a familiarity that did not need to prove itself, and that was what made it impossible to dismiss. Because true mastery does not announce itself, it reveals itself, and as the passage grew more complex, the tempo demanding, the transitions tighter, her movements remained steady, fluid, unbroken, as if difficulty itself had no authority over her, and the room began to understand, not all at once, but piece by piece, that what they were witnessing did not belong to the role they had assigned her. Professor Langford's expression changed next, though only slightly, his eyes narrowing as he stepped closer to the piano, drawn not by curiosity alone, but by the need to confirm what he was hearing, to locate the flaw that would restore his certainty. But it did not come, because there was nothing to correct, nothing to challenge, only something to recognize. And that realization pressed quietly against everything he believed about control, about authority, about who was qualified to stand at that instrument. A whisper broke through the silence, barely audible, but enough to ripple through the stillness. That is not beginner technique. And the words carried weight, because they gave voice to what others were beginning to feel, and with that the illusion that had framed the moment began to collapse, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, each note dismantling it further. Evelyn's expression remained calm, focused, as if she were not performing for them at all, as if the music existed independently of their judgment. And that was what changed everything, because for the first time, the room was no longer evaluating her. It was listening, truly listening. And as the melody deepened, filling the hall with a presence that felt larger than the instrument itself, something within that space shifted completely, the balance of authority no longer resting where it once had, but moving, quietly, undeniably, toward the one person they had chosen not to see. And in that moment, without a single word spoken, the lesson they thought they were teaching had already begun to turn against them. The music did not slow, it deepened, unfolding into something far more complex than the notes on the page. And with every passing second, the room moved further away from what it thought it understood, the boundaries between student and master, between observer and performer, quietly dissolving under the weight of what they were hearing, because this was no longer a demonstration. It was something else entirely, something that could not be measured or graded, something that demanded recognition, rather than permission. Evelyn's hands moved with fluid precision, crossing seamlessly over one another, her fingers landing on each key with an accuracy that made the difficulty invisible. And that was what unsettled them most. Not just that she could play, but that she could make something so complex appear effortless, as if the music did not challenge her, but belonged to her. The students felt it first, the shift from evaluation to realization, their expressions tightening not in judgment, but in focus, as if they were trying to catch up to something that had already surpassed them. And one by one, the small sounds in the room disappeared completely. No shifting chairs, no quiet whispers, no nervous laughter, only stillness. And within that stillness, something larger began to take shape. Professor Langford stood closer now, though he had not consciously moved, his attention fixed entirely on her hands, searching for the flaw that would restore the structure he had built his authority upon. But it did not appear, because there was no hesitation, no break in rhythm, no sign of uncertainty. Only control, not the rigid control he taught, but something more natural, something internal, something that could not be replicated through instruction alone. The piece entered its most demanding passage, a sequence that required speed, precision, and emotional restraint, a moment where even advanced performers often faltered, and the tension in the room returned. But it had transformed. It was no longer anticipation of failure. It was anticipation of confirmation, because deep down, without admitting it, they already knew what was coming. And Evelyn moved through it without hesitation, her hands gliding across the keys with seamless coordination. Every note placed exactly where it belonged, every transition effortless. And that was when the silence changed again, becoming heavier, more complete, not just the absence of sound, but the presence of understanding. A faculty member near the back leaned forward, his expression sharpening with recognition, because there was something familiar in the way she shaped the music, something that did not come from textbooks or rehearsals, something that came from experience, from stages far beyond this room. And he whispered quietly, almost to himself, that phrasing, and though the words were soft, they carried through the silence, because they confirmed what no one could deny anymore. Langford's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, the confidence that had once defined him no longer absolute, his gaze no longer evaluating, but searching, not for mistakes, but for answers. And as the final sequence approached, the room held its breath, not out of doubt, but out of certainty, because the outcome had already been decided, not by expectation, but by truth. And in that moment, before the final note had even been played, everything had already changed. The lesson had reversed, the authority had shifted, and the person they had chosen to underestimate had quietly become the one redefining everything they believed about talent, about presence, and about what it truly means to belong. The final sequence arrived not with force, but with inevitability, each note falling into place with a precision that no longer surprised the room, because by now, they understood, not fully, not completely, but enough to know that what they were witnessing was no accident, no exception. It was truth revealing itself in real time. And as Evelyn's hands moved toward the closing passage, the air itself seemed to hold still, as if the room had learned, at last, how to listen. The last notes unfolded slowly, deliberately, not rushed, not exaggerated, but controlled with a quiet confidence that carried more weight than anything loud or dramatic ever could. And when the final note was played, it did not end the performance. It lingered, suspended in the silence that followed, a silence so complete it no longer felt empty. It felt full, filled with realization, filled with something unspoken but understood by everyone present. No one moved, not immediately, because movement would have broken something that had not yet fully settled, and Evelyn remained still for a moment, her hands resting lightly above the keys before she lowered them, not with triumph, not with acknowledgement, but with the same quiet composure she had carried into the room, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if this had never been about proving anything at all. Professor Langford stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the piano, then on her, and for the first time, there was no calculation in his expression, no attempt to measure or evaluate, only a quiet recognition that what he had just witnessed existed beyond his authority, beyond his structure, beyond everything he had believed defined excellence. And though he opened his mouth slightly, as if to speak, no words came, because there are moments when language cannot keep up with truth. A student near the front exhaled softly, the sound louder than expected in the stillness. Another shifted in their seat, their eyes still fixed on Evelyn as if trying to understand what had just happened. And then, almost involuntarily, a voice from the back whispered, "That was not taught." And the words settled into the room with quiet certainty, because they were not an opinion, they were a realization. The faculty member who had spoken earlier stepped forward slightly, his expression thoughtful, and though he did not speak again, his presence alone confirmed what others had begun to understand, that what they had witnessed belonged to something far beyond the lesson that had been intended. Evelyn stood then, smoothing the edge of her cardigan with a simple, habitual motion, her expression unchanged, her eyes calm, and without looking for approval, without waiting for acknowledgement, she stepped away from the piano, her footsteps soft against the marble floor as she moved toward the edge of the room, and still no one stopped her, no one questioned her, because there was nothing left to challenge, nothing left to prove, only something to accept. As she reached the doorway, she paused briefly, not turning back, not seeking recognition, but simply allowing the moment to exist for one final breath, and then she stepped out, the door closing gently behind her, leaving the room exactly as it was, silent, still, and permanently changed, because once respect arrives without being asked for, it does not leave, it remains, shaping everything that follows in ways that no one can fully explain, but no one can deny. The silence did not end when she left. It lingered, stretching across the room like something unfinished, something that refused to be dismissed. And for a long moment no one spoke, not because they did not know what to say, but because whatever they said would not be enough. And Professor Langford remained standing where he was, his hand resting lightly on the piano as if it could anchor him to something familiar. But even that felt different now, because the instrument he had once used to measure others had just revealed something he could not measure at all. The students shifted slowly, not breaking the silence, but adjusting to it, as if they were learning how to exist in a space where their assumptions no longer held the same weight. One student closed his notebook without writing another word. Another stared at the keys as if seeing them for the first time, not as a challenge to conquer, but as something to understand. And in those small, quiet changes, the impact of what had happened began to take root. Langford finally stepped back from the piano, his posture still composed, but no longer rigid, his expression thoughtful in a way that did not seek to restore authority, but to reconsider it. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, not weakened, but measured. "What you just witnessed," he said, pausing briefly, as if choosing each word with care, "was not something that can be taught in this room." And the students listened, not out of obligation, but because they wanted to, because something in them had shifted as well. A student raised his hand slowly, the same one who had laughed earlier, his expression now serious, almost uncertain. "Then what was it?" he asked, and the question settled into the room, not as a challenge, but as a search for meaning. And Langford looked at him, really looked this time, not as someone to correct, but as someone asking the right question, and after a moment, he answered. "It was understanding," he said quietly, "the kind that comes from living with the music, not just practicing it." and the words carried a weight that no lecture could replicate. Another student leaned forward slightly, her voice softer than before. "How did we not see it?" she asked, and the room seemed to hold its breath again, not out of tension, but out of recognition, because the answer mattered, not just for her, but for all of them, and Langford did not rush his response. He allowed the question to exist, to settle, to be felt, before he spoke. "Because you decided who she was before you ever listened," he said, and this time, there was no authority in his voice. Only truth. Outside, the late afternoon lights softened across the stone steps as Evelyn walked away from the conservatory, her pace steady, her expression unchanged, the city moving around her without pause, without recognition, and she did not look back. She did not need to, because whatever had happened inside those walls no longer belonged to her. It had already taken root where it needed to. And as she disappeared into the rhythm of the street, the weight of her presence remained behind, not as a memory that would fade, but as something that would continue to shape what came next. Back inside, the room remained still, not empty, but full of something new, something that could not be undone. Because once a moment reveals the truth without asking for permission, it changes everything that follows. And in that quiet realization, something lasting had begun, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, because respect, once truly understood, does not need to be demanded, it simply remains. The conservatory no longer felt the same, not because anything visible had changed, but because something invisible had settled into its walls, something that altered the way people moved, the way they spoke, the way they listened, and in the days that followed, that quiet shift began to reveal itself in ways no one could ignore. Students who once rushed into practice now paused before touching the keys, their hands hovering for a moment as if asking a question they had never considered before, not what to play, but how to understand. And in those pauses, something new began to form. Professor Langford stood once again at the front of the rehearsal hall, but the certainty that had once defined him no longer filled the space in the same way. His posture remained composed. His presence still carried authority, but there was a restraint now, a quiet awareness that had not been there before. And when he looked at the students, he did not see them as quickly, did not measure them as sharply. Instead, he observed, as if searching for something deeper than technical skill. "Play," he said simply, nodding toward one of the students, and the young man approached the piano with confidence. But as he began, something was different, not in the notes, but in the way they were received, because the room was no longer listening for mistakes. It was listening for meaning, and that change, subtle as it was, made every sound feel different, every phrase heavier, every pause more important. Langford listened as well, not with the intention of correcting, but with the intention of understanding. And when the student finished, the silence that followed was not empty. It was thoughtful, and instead of speaking immediately, Langford allowed it to remain, because he understood now that silence itself had something to teach. "What did you hear?" he asked finally, not pointing out flaws, not offering critique, but inviting reflection. And the question caught the student off guard, not because it was difficult, but because it was unfamiliar. And after a moment, he answered, "I heard the notes." And Langford nodded slightly, not dismissing the response, but guiding it. "And what did you feel?" he asked, and the room grew still again. Because this was not the kind of question they were used to answering, and yet it was. The kind that now mattered. Across the conservatory, similar moments began to unfold, small, quiet changes that reshaped the way people approached their craft, not through instruction, but through awareness. And though no one spoke her name, though no one formally acknowledged what had happened, her presence remained, not physically, but in the way the space had changed, in the way assumptions were now questioned before they were accepted. Outside, the city moved as it always had, indifferent to the shifts taking place within those marble walls. And Evelyn continued through her life with the same quiet rhythm, her steps steady, her expression unchanged, never seeking recognition, never needing it, because what she carried had never depended on who noticed. And as she disappeared into the flow of the street, it became clear that the moment she had left behind was never about her staying. It was about what remained after she was gone. And back inside the conservatory, that presence lingered, shaping
Observe the
every
precise
note, every
articulation required
silence,
in this measure.
every moment of
You
reflection.
actually think you can
Because once
play
a
this?
room learns to listen, truly listen, it can never return to the way it was before. The transformation did not announce itself. It revealed itself slowly, in the quiet details that most people would have overlooked before, but now could not ignore. And within the conservatory, the change had settled deeper than anyone expected, not as a memory, but as a presence that reshaped how every moment was experienced, how every note was heard. And Professor Langford felt it most in the spaces between sound, in the pauses where silence no longer felt empty, but meaningful, as if something unseen had taken residence there. One evening, long after the students had left, the rehearsal hall stood in stillness, the grand piano resting beneath soft overhead lights, its surface reflecting the quiet emptiness of the room, and Langford stood alone beside it, his hand resting lightly against the edge, not in control, not in authority, but in contemplation. And for the first time in years, he did not approach the instrument as a teacher, but as a listener. He sat down slowly, his posture less rigid than before, his movements deliberate, as if acknowledging that what he was about to do required something different from what he had always relied on. And when his fingers touched the keys, the sound that followed was not incorrect, not flawed, but it lacked something he could now recognize but not yet reach. And that realization settled heavily, not as failure, but as awareness. He paused, his hands hovering above the keys, and in that
This
silence,
modulation is
he
hardly
remembered,
revolutionary,
not
yet it
clearly,
consistently
not
challenges
completely,
students.
but enough to
Observe
understand
the
that what had been
precise
revealed to him
articulation
was not a
required in this
technique he
measure.
could replicate.
You
It was a
actually think you
depth
can
he had
play
yet to
this?
access, and for the first time, he did not resist that truth. Across the city, the evening air carried a quiet calm as Evelyn walked along a dimly lit street, the soft glow of storefronts reflecting in the windows as she passed, her steps steady, her presence unchanged, and though the world moved around her without pause, without recognition, something about her remained constant, something that did not seek to be seen, because it did not depend on being seen to exist. Back inside the conservatory, Langford lifted his hands again, not to perform, not to prove, but to listen, and the notes he played were softer this time, more deliberate, shaped not by expectation, but by attention, and though they were not perfect, they carried something new, something that had not been there before, and as the final note faded into the quiet of the empty hall, he did not rush to fill the silence. He allowed it to remain, understanding now that within that silence existed something more valuable than any correction he could offer. The room held that moment gently, without judgment, without expectation, and in that stillness, something continued to grow, not loudly, not visibly, but steadily, shaping the way the space would be experienced long after this night had passed. Because once the meaning of silence is understood, it no longer disappears, it becomes part of everything that follows, and in that quiet realization, the lesson that had begun days before had not ended, it had only begun to deepen. Time did
This
not erase
modulation
what
is
had
hardly
happened within the
revolutionary,
walls of
yet
the
it consistently
conservatory. It
challenges
refined it,
students.
shaping it into
Observe the
something
precise
quieter but
articulation
far more
required in this
permanent.
measure.
And as new
You
students
actually
walked
think you
those
can
marble
play this?
floors, unaware of the moment that had once unfolded there, they still felt it, not as a story, but as a presence, something embedded in the way the room held silence. Something that could not be seen but could be sensed in the way people paused before speaking, before playing, before judging. Professor Langford stood once again before another class, different faces, the same expectations, but he was no longer the same man who had once believed he could define talent at a glance. And when he looked at them now, he did not see certainty, he saw possibility, something far more complex, far less predictable. And when he gestured toward the piano, he did not command, he invited. Take your time, he said quietly, and though the words were simple, they carried a meaning shaped by everything that had come before. A student approached the instrument, her hands hovering above the keys in a moment of hesitation, and for a brief second, the room held its breath, not waiting for perfection, but allowing space. And in that space, something new existed, something that had not been there before, the understanding that what mattered could not always be seen at first glance. And as she began to play, the notes filled the room differently, not just as sound, but as expression, and Langford listened, truly listened, not for flaws, but for presence. Outside, The city continued its steady rhythm, unchanged, indifferent, and somewhere within it, Evelyn moved through her day as she always had, her steps quiet, her expression calm, her life untouched by recognition, because what she carried had never depended on being seen, and that was what made it endure, because truth that exists without validation does not fade when attention shifts. It remains steady and unshaken. Back inside the conservatory, the lesson lived on, not spoken, not written, but understood, carried in the way students now looked twice before deciding, in the way silence was no longer something to fill, but something to respect, and in that quiet awareness, something lasting had taken root, something that would continue long after the details of that day had been forgotten, because what had been revealed was not just talent. It was perspective, and perspective, once changed, does not return to what it was before. And so the room remained, the piano remained, the structure remained, but the way they were experienced had shifted forever, because once someone shows you what dignity looks like without asking for attention, without demanding recognition, without needing approval, you do not forget it. You carry it, quietly, in the way you see the world, in the way you listen, and in the way you choose who deserves to be seen. And on that day, without raising her voice, without asking for anything in return, she changed everything.